All right. So I am here to just ask you a couple easy, simple questions, and we'll go from there.
Take off.
So, how old were you when you wrote your first book?
How old was I?
Yeah, when you wrote your first book.
Well, I'm 78 now, so I guess about 66, 65, 66.
All right. And then, why did you choose to do westerns?
Well, I grew up on a cattle farm, not a ranch, but a cattle farm in central Missouri back in the 50s. So I know something about cows and horses. Doesn't necessarily make me an expert, but I know a bit about them. And my dad loves to read Zane Grey. He owned the entire library. And I never cared for the books, really. I read Tappan's Burrow and as a school assignment and kind of liked it, but I never could really get into the others, probably because I was young and those things just didn't interest me, as a teenager. And then I went into the military, and essentially everything I did there involved writing of one type or another. I wrote procedures, manuals, corrected effectiveness reports and things like that, and kind of got forced into it. But that's another story that we don't need to get into. And then when I left in the military, I went to work with Fluor Corporation on nuclear power plants, and I was in quality assurance. So I had to write all manner of things for depositions, for hearings on, court hearings on nuclear power, inspection reports, blah, blah, blah. Just something I did. And then I wrote op-eds for different newspapers as I moved around. And then one bright, shiny morning while I was drinking coffee, my wife said, "Why don't you write a fiction book?" And I said, I wouldn't have a clue how to do that. And she said, "It's full of, let's say, baloney as you are. You wouldn't have a bit of problem with it." So I wrote a book. It wasn't a Western. It was, what was the name of it? Mine's a horrible thing to lose, isn't it?
It happens to me all the time. When you need that one thing, I lose it.
Yeah. East of Eden. It was again something I kind of sort of knew something about. It was a takeoff on the Bible book of Genesis and Cain's journey from the Garden of Eden to a place which is unknown named Nod or Nud in Sumerian. So I wrote a book on it, and it's all fiction. It's not meant to complement the Bible or contradict the Bible or anything else. It's just a story. People kind of sort of liked it. So I wrote a book about my childhood home and used real characters of the period when I grew up and threw in a fictitious kidnapping and murder. And people liked it better. Right. So I wrote a book called Retribution. And again, I'm from Missouri, grew up there, and I know the area. So this guy is a middle-aged man who's a circuit court judge in Bolivar, Missouri. His only child, a daughter, marries a farm boy in there. They go to Texas and build a small ranching operation, have a couple of kids. Some leftovers from the Civil War that couldn't find anything better to do came through, killed him, killed her, killed the grandchildren. So he resigns from the bench, gets out his Civil War sharpshooter rifle and his double-barrel shotgun and goes to Texas and starts looking for him.
A classic little revenge story there.
Yeah, well, it's pretty straightforward. People liked it. So I wrote one then called The Cattleman, which is about two boys that grew up on adjacent farms in Missouri. One of them got in a mess and had to leave, was a young guy, about 17. The other guy went with him. They went to Texas and rounded up cattle and sold them, served in the Civil War as scouts for the Confederacy. Came back and they built a big ranch in Texas, and farmers started encroaching on public land, so they moved the whole operation to Montana and built an even bigger ranching operation there. And people liked it, so then I wrote a book called The Horseman, which is the sons of the cattlemen. And it's obviously a generation later, and one man has three boys, the other man had one. Two of the boys go to West Point and become cavalry officers. The third son goes to Lift College in Denver and becomes a Methodist minister. Doesn't like preaching, so he goes in the Army as a chaplain. And the lone son becomes a Texas Ranger. So after that, I wrote a 2-book series about a Branson family. What I normally use is surnames of people that owned adjacent farms around where we lived in Missouri.
Okay.
at my age, it's easy to remember a name I'm familiar with.
Right.
So I wrote about a man named Branson, and I wrote about him and his exploits. And then the sequel to it is called Branson's Law, and it's about the rest of the Bransons and a cousin, a female cousin. And a lot of the second book is actually about her. In fact, I think I've written 5 books that are principally about Western women. Then I wrote about one of the sons of Branson who became a military spy, went to West Point and became a military spy. And it's kind of an intriguing story and takes him to Germany during World War I and England during World War I. Then I wrote The Frontiersman, which on DSP, I guess, is one of my, if not the biggest seller, very, very near the biggest seller. And it's a story about a young boy who leaves Missouri and goes to the Rocky Mountains to become a mountain man. And that only becomes part of the story. He ends up finding a young woman while in the mountains that had been captured by the Indians and brings her out and ends up settling in Denver. And then I wrote one called The Indian Fighter, which is kind of sort of what the name implies. It's about a kid from Missouri that goes to Arizona to become an Arizona Ranger. And the Arizona Rangers were disbanded shortly after he joined, which actually happened. And he and another guy went out on their own to capture, not necessarily kill, but to capture Apaches for the bounty on them if they return them so they could be, placed on reservation. And then I wrote a book called The Native Land, which has turned out to be, according to Nick, my bestseller. It's a story about a Missouri family during the Civil War. They and their 2 sons leave to go to Colorado. Missouri during the Civil War was a hotbed for guerrilla activities, and guerrillas went around stealing whatever they needed, and they were stealing their cows and their chickens and their hogs and whatever else they had. So it was either go leave or starve. So they made a good choice. They went to Colorado, and it outlines the things that happened to them on that long procrastinated wagon train, small wagon train going to Colorado. And it's written in 2 parts. The second part of the book chronicles their building of a ranching operation in Colorado once they got there. And for whatever reason, people have taken to that book, and it sells a lot of copies.
It's always the ones you least expect. Those are the ones that are successful.
I had my accountant told me, he said, one of these days, one of your books is really going to sell well. And he said, it probably won't be the book you think it's going to be. And that's not to say Native Land's a bad book. I don't think it is, but I would say a couple others that I wrote are probably better, in my opinion. As a reader, I wrote a book, and I'm kind of prattling along here. So if you want to interrupt me, ask me something, or tell me to shut up, go ahead.
Hey, you're good. I'm enjoying it.
And I wrote Montana Cattle Queen, and it is a long book. It's fast moving, but it is long and detailed. It's about a woman from birth to death. Her mother dies in childbirth. Her father raises her against the advice of people that said he couldn't. They move eventually to Lawrence, Kansas, when she's still very young, teenager. Quantrill's raiders come through Lawrence, kill everyone that wore long pants, and that actually happened. And her father and brother in the book were 2 of them killed. So after she gets them buried, she finds some small man's clothing and dresses as a male and goes to Rolla, Missouri, and joins the Union Army as a sharpshooter. Her father taught her 2 things: how to play poker and how to fire a rifle. And she was very good at both of them. and she does all kinds of things. She becomes a riverboat gambler. She becomes a nurse in New Orleans, nursing Union soldiers who are shot up during the war. And then she wins half of a ranch in a poker game and becomes the Montana Cattle Queen incident to that. And then I wrote 3 murder mysteries. They're set in the West, but they are principally murder mysteries. There are side stories and things in them, of course, but they're basically murder mysteries. One is called Maggie's Pleasure Palace. We were in Corpus Christi, Texas, and my wife had spinal surgery. And while I was taking care of her while she recovered, she asked me to write her a murder mystery. So Maggie's Pleasure Palace, her name is not Maggie. And she doesn't own a brothel, at least not to my knowledge. I've never seen any of the money if she does. And I wrote it for her. And it's a good book. People seem to like it. And then I wrote a murder mystery called Capital Murders, which is set during the impeachment of Andrew Johnson after the assassination of Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the incidents that I capture in there are true, and some of the people were actual people that were involved. There was one faction trying to get him out of office and another faction trying to keep him in office, and they were both doing all kinds of shenanigans. Some of the books true, some of the books fiction. And then I wrote one called Deception. And if you like a murder mystery that's very difficult to figure out, you'll like it because it'll give you a headache.
That sounds like one for my wife.
I get emails and people typically, well, I've never had anybody say they figured it out until they got to the last page. So apparently I did a pretty good job with it.
Yeah, hey, that's always something you want to hear.
And then I wrote 3 series. The first one's The Marshal, and it's about a guy who kind of fell into the job. And then in book 1, and then in book 2, he's a real good tracker. And Attorney General in Missouri sends him to track the killer of a judge who went to law school with the Attorney General. He's in and of himself, the judge was of no consequence other than he was a friend of the Attorney General. And this guy killed him. And you have to buy the book to find out why he killed him. But anyway, he tracks this guy all the way from Nebraska to Canada. And it has kind of an interesting ending. And then he gets selected to go on a trip to France, or was it France? Yeah, to France. And he interacts with the French police there, learning their tactics and teaching them, how American policemen work. He gets involved in all kinds of different things while he's there. And late in that book, when he gets back, he meets a love interest while he's there. And when he gets back, he gets involved in tracking a man who's an outlaw and killer, and kind of sort of saves this young girl that's in, we would call it today, an orphanage. It was a place for wayward girls back then, unmanageable girls without parents. And then book 4 is about her. She's the principal character all through the book. And it's based on the feedback I get. Everybody seems to think it. I mean, it's not a girly book.
Right.
She's a tough little cookie, but it's interesting and it moves along.
Yeah.
And then I wrote 2 7-book series. I wrote one called Bounty Hunter, a guy named Spike Davis. He goes west from Missouri and kind of falls into bounty hunting by accident and kills the wrong guy. And some people named Wheelers come from Missouri to kill him. That's in book 2. And then once he gets settled up with them, their nephews, called the Solomons, come from Missouri to kill him. And when that don't work out, in book 4, a hillbilly, who's the worst of the whole bunch, comes to Colorado to kill him. And then in book 5, he goes to rescue some children from Comancheros, he and his brother. And then in book 6, a hired assassin comes from Missouri to kill him. And then in book 7, about the bandits, and he and the assassin, who in book 6 actually become friends, go after a group of bandits. And in the last series is the Texas Ranger, and it's about the Branson family, and harking all the way back to the lawman in Branson's law. There's 10 people that are Bransons, and all of them are involved in law enforcement back in the 1800s. And that whole series of books, 1 through 7, deals with different individuals who are Bransons and in law enforcement. And in the last 2 books, well, a girl, Branson, female, young woman, is introduced in book 6, and then book 7 is about her, pretty much her from start to finish.
Okay.
And she's not a girly person either. She's like you needed to be for the time period.
Right.
And then Nick raved so much about native land and how people were liking it. I wrote a sequel to it, and it's completed as far as being written, and it's in the proofing and editing phase.
Gotcha. I think I remember hearing something about it. Well, hey, real quick, we'll move on to the next question. So I hear a lot about the Bransons. So are those your favorite characters to write, or do you have different characters you enjoy writing more?
Well, the Branson name is familiar to me. And I think those books are fast moving. They're short, about 30,000 words, something like that, about 150 pages on a 5x8 format. So you can sit down with a couple cups of coffee and read them probably in 3 or 4 hours. They got a lot of action in them. They're all different. My wife and I were talking a couple of hours ago while I was eating lunch, and she reads my book. She never was interested in Westerns, but she started reading them when I started writing them. And she said, I'm amazed, you've written 40 some books and none of them are alike. She said, you somehow managed to come up with a total new story, a total new, happening.
It's quite the achievement for sure.
And I don't know how I do it. I just sit down in front of a word processor and start pecking away and kind of put myself as an observer in the story and hopefully do a good job with it.
Right. So for my next one is where do you draw most of your inspiration from? I know that you said some stuff about like your childhood you draw from. Is there anything else?
No, not really. I think most boys of the time period I grew up in wanted to be cowboys. Mm-hmm. My brother and I played all over the limestone hills on our farm, playing cowboys and Indians and so forth and so on. It was just kind of a natural inclination to write about them because I enjoyed it. I have read probably everything Louis L'Amour ever wrote. Some I thought were real interesting, and some were just kind of a regurgitation of the same story over and over and with a different name. But most of them are enjoyable. So anyway, I just got into the first Western and just kept writing them for no real good reason other than that I just enjoyed it.
Yeah, once that train starts moving, no use stopping it.
Yep, I guess.
And then do you yourself, being a writer, do you enjoy reading? And what's your favorite book? If you have, obviously you have read, but what would be your favorite book out of the stuff that you have read?
Oh, I used to read a lot, and I enjoyed reading the Vince Flynn novels. He's deceased, so he's not writing them anymore. Mm-hmm. And I read a lot of books by a guy you've probably never heard of called W.E.B. Griffin.
The name's familiar. I feel like I have somewhere along the lines. He's come up in something, I'm sure.
Yeah, he wrote series. He wrote a lot of books, and he may still be writing them for all I know. He wrote one about the Marines. He wrote one about the Army. He wrote another book about Secret Service agents, on and on and on. And they were interesting, especially the ones about the Marines, a guy named Kelly. I enjoyed those 2 or 3 books. I like some of Hemingway's work, mm-hmm. and some of them I don't really care about. But, probably some of my books people like, some they don't care about. So.
Everyone has their opinions.
But I just don't read much now. When you've written 44 books, and I think I've written perhaps 8 or 10 since Christmas. So it doesn't leave a whole lot of time to be reading other people's work.
No, that's what I figured.
Yeah. I just started a new book, which is a departure from Westerns. I don't really know what the title of it's going to be, but it is a book about a contract assassin during the 1960s. And it's coming together pretty well. I guess I've got it about half done, and I haven't run out of scenarios yet. So we'll see how it ends up.
Yeah, hey.
I don't know how much Nick's going to like it not being a Western, but
I'm sure they'll find a place for it.
It will be whatever it will be. It's being, at this point, it's fun to write. Mm-hmm. And I'm using, since I was in the military during the same time period that I'm writing about, I'm using the places that I worked as the locations for this guy, which makes it easier. There's a lot less research to do.
Oh, for sure.
But having said that, to me, Westerns are pretty easy to write. You just have to make sure that a town that you're writing about actually existed during a time period, and the weapon the guy's shooting at somebody was actually manufactured and available during the time period.
Right.
It's a little more complicated when you're working in the 1960s, because you're putting them in automobiles. Automobiles have a name. Mm-hmm. In a Western, you can call a guy's horse old paint or fuzzy or whatever you want to, but it has to be a Chevy or a Ford or something, and the model had to be available during that year, blah, blah, blah.
That year or like the year before or something, yeah.
Yeah, it's tougher to put it together. Mm-hmm. And I'm real anal about making sure to the extent that I can that whatever I put in the book is accurate,
And
historically accurate.
And I think that's really respectable. I appreciate a lot of times when they go out of their way, like authors or writers or whoever go out of their way to make sure that if they're doing like a historical fiction, they don't accidentally name a car brand from like 1958 when the book takes place in like 55 or something.
Yeah. There's nothing more disconcerting to me than watch a movie on television and a guy's using a gun that didn't even exist during the time period. To me, it just ruins the whole story.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I figure if you don't care enough to do the research and make it real, probably the story's not going to be that great either. And typically they aren't.
No, typically not, especially if they get like little details like that wrong. There's not much saving it at that point.
No, you're pretty well lost before you get started real good.
Exactly. So, have you traveled out west, and what's your favorite place to visit if you have?
Oh, I would say without a doubt, Colorado Springs, Colorado. It's just gorgeous. We've made 3 trips out there on book tours,
mm-hmm.
and it's normally around anywhere from the low 50s to mid 50s at night, and then the 70s during the day. Nice gentle breeze. The people are by and large patriotic. And it's just a great, great place.
Mm-hmm.
If I were younger, I don't think I'd settle in the town of Colorado Springs. But if I were younger, I would go out in that part of the world and buy a little bit of property and probably buy a horse and settle down.
Yeah, I hear. I'm not even like too educated myself on the Western stuff, but I hear Colorado Springs is like the place to be. That's like one of the best.
It is. And again, we're retired military. So when we go out there, we stay at Penguin Pines RV Park, which is right on the base. And it's nice. And it's centrally located to go to the book signings that I do while I'm out there.
Oh, okay. That's great. And then typically, how long would you say it takes you to write a novel? And do you have like a certain routine you get in? Like you start each day with a special cup of coffee or something when you go to write, or?
No, not really. I spend too much time sitting and writing. I get involved in a story and I get engrossed in it. I'll come out. I'm in my little office up here in North Carolina now, and I'll come out here to spend 2 hours writing, and I look up and it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon and I've been out here all day. It's not necessarily good for you physically to just sit.
Right.
And I do far too much of it. And I always say when I finish a book, well, I'm not going to write anything else for a while. And then a while turns out to be 2 weeks, and here we go again.
You get the inspiration strikes, and you got to hit while the iron's hot.
It keeps me off the streets.
If you were to talk to your younger self now, what advice would you give yourself, being the experienced writer that you are now? What advice would you give to your younger self?
Probably don't write books. and that's said in jest, but the reality is, in the day and age we live now, there are so many people writing books.
Mm-hmm.
And the Western genre is so saturated with authors, writers, and I don't know any, well, I know a couple of them, but I don't know their work. In other words, I haven't written or read their books, but I suspect that some of them are not very good books.
I'm sure if it's that saturated, I'm sure.
When there's thousands of people writing books, they're all going to sell a few. Even if you sell them to your friends and family, it takes away from what other people would have sold.
Mm-hmm.
So the hope of making any real money as an author, when I say real money, I'm talking about, up in hundreds of thousands of dollars, is just not realistic.
Right.
If you can pay your expenses, you've probably done pretty well. And when we take these longer book tours, which we're not doing this year because of gas and other obligations we have, if we can break even and had a good time and ate some good steaks while we travel and meet some nice people, we think it's a good accomplishment. Right. And life's not really all about money anyway. Life is about doing what you enjoy doing.
Right. If you have the passion to write, it doesn't really matter what monetary value you put on it.
Well, we've been pretty fortunate. We're not starving. We're not rich, but we're not starving.
Right. That's a good mindset.
Yeah. As Will Rogers told John D. Rockefeller once when they were in a party in New York City, Rockefeller was going through all these holdings he had, things he was investing in. he turns and said, "How are things with you financially?" He says, "Well, apparently a lot better than you. I got all I want." And that's a good way to look at life. You're not going to take it with you. And as long as you have all the creature comforts you want, why strive to keep adding to the stack?
Right. And then we have two more questions, and I know we kind of have to speed through this a little bit. We only have about 5 minutes left, but
all right, go ahead.
What would be the most difficult part of your writing journey?
Selling books.
That's true. We did just talk about that.
I find writing books extraordinarily easy,
Mhm.
you know, and I just kind of fell into it like most things that I've done in my life, and found I enjoyed it. And I guess I'm fairly good at it. Anyway, I start one and I finish one, and people seem to enjoy them. Either that or they're lying to me because they say they enjoy it. But we talked about that a little bit just a few minutes ago.
Mhm.
Marketing books is really tough.
Yeah.
It's really tough to sell an appreciable amount of books, enough that you can make any real money.
Right.
So that's the hard part. Writing is the easy part to me. And I'm lucky. I have a team of proofreaders and editors, all of them who have master's degree in English, and they work for free. And I have a friend who, judging by your appearance, is probably about your age, who's a designer.
Okay.
Digital designer, I guess, is what his specialty is. He went to school in Italy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Florence, yeah. He's a graduate from an art school in Florence, Italy. He's really good, and he's kind of really more like a grandson to me than just some guy that does my work. And he does all my book covers for me.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, he's a neat kid and does excellent work.
Yeah, that's great. And then for our final question, I think you already did touch on this, but what are you working on next?
I'm working on this book about this contract killer.
Yep.
And I think the name of the book's going to be The Problem Solver, because that's basically what he does. The CIA does not want to get their hands dirty, typically in the United States, and they're not allowed by law to do assassinations, but that don't mean they can't hire somebody to do it.
Right.
And that's kind of this young guy's specialty. He stumbles into it, and he goes to basic training in the military, and he gets called into while he's in basic training, to the chaplain's office, and the chaplain of all people asked him if he's interested in working in something that's very interesting.
Yeah, it sounds it.
And he goes and trains. He goes to Fort Bragg and trains with the 5th Combat Force there. Goes through their special training, and then he's sent to the farm, CIA farm, and got a whole lot more extensive training there, and then went to work. He got his day job as an airman in the Air Force, and then when they need him to do something, they send him on a TDY someplace, and then he goes and does whatever they want him to do.
All right. Well, we look forward to that, I'm sure.
It's fun to write so far.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for doing this interview, and I appreciate your time.
I enjoyed it. Good talking to you.
Thank you. You too.
Well, Trent, I appreciate it. You have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much.